I don't know where you're watching from. Maybe from an airport waiting room or a crowded cafe where words get lost in a sea of languages. Maybe you're just hoping someone will understand you when everything feels like a battle. It doesn't matter where you are or what you've been through, but today's story will touch your heart in ways you didn't expect. Picture this: a grand international airport in New York City, pulsing with the endless rhythm of travelers rushing by, voices blending in dozens of accents and tongues. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across polished marble floors, while the constant hum of announcements echoes through terminals that never sleep. Amid the crowd stands Samir, an Arab millionaire whose life has been shaped by power and privilege. Yet today he feels reduced to a nameless figure in this cold, bureaucratic maze. His dark eyes scan the terminal, calm and dignified, but brimming with a storm of confusion and fear. The expensive Italian leather of his briefcase feels familiar in his grip, a tangible reminder of the empire he's built through decades of strategic investments in technology stocks and real estate ventures across 3 continents. His tailored Armani suit, worth more than most people earn in months, feels like armor, and yet it can't shield him from the cold chains of wrongful suspicion that now bind him to this sterile holding area. Samir's hands rest steady on his briefcase, containing contracts worth millions in cryptocurrency transactions and international business partnerships, but his heart pounds with silent desperation. He's been detained, held back by airport security over what they claim is a suspicious document. Their questions come sharp and relentless, their suspicion palpable as they examine his passport with the scrutiny reserved for those they've already judged guilty. He answers politely, his English impeccable after 20 years in New York, his voice firm but patient, as he tries to bridge a gulf of misunderstanding that seems to widen with each passing moment. But no one truly listens. The security officers exchange glances loaded with assumptions, their body language broadcasting distrust as they flip through his documentation again and again. Behind bulletproof glass, other travelers glance over nervously, some with sympathy, others with the uncomfortable relief of not being in his position. The air conditioning hums with mechanical coldness, and the scent of industrial cleaning supplies mingles with the anxiety that seems to permeate everything in this confined space where dignity comes to die. For Samir, this isn't just about the delay or the public humiliation. It cuts deeper into unseen wounds of identity and belonging that have never fully healed. His massive fortune, built through careful diversification of assets from oil futures to Bitcoin investments, means nothing here. All his achievements, his charitable foundations, his reputation as one of the Middle East's most respected business innovators evaporate in the face of cold stares and whispered accusations. He's just another target in a world increasingly blinded by fear and prejudice. Through the sterile glass partition, he can see the terminal cafe where tired travelers grab quick meals between flights. The aroma of coffee and pastries drifts faintly through the air vents, a cruel reminder of the normal world just beyond his reach. His throat feels dry, but he won't ask for water, not from men who look at him like he's already guilty of crimes he's never committed. The marble beneath his handcrafted Italian shoes feels cold, unforgiving, like the faces surrounding him in this bureaucratic purgatory. And then, through the chaotic noise of announcements and mechanical sounds, a gentle voice rises, soft, clear, unmistakably human. It comes from beyond the partition, where a young woman in a cafe uniform has been watching the proceedings with growing distress. Her name tag reads Lena, and her dark hair is pulled back in the practical style of someone who works long shifts on her feet. "Samir," she calls out, stepping closer to the glass barrier that separates the detention area from the public terminal. Her voice carries across the space with surprising clarity, cutting through the institutional coldness like warm honey. The security officers look up, startled by this unexpected interruption to their careful procedures. "Ana min al-Watan," she whispers in Arabic, her native tongue flowing like music after the harsh English interrogation that has dominated the last 3 hours. I am from the homeland. The phrase hangs in the processed air like incense, transforming the sterile space into something suddenly, impossibly sacred. The room seems to tilt, the cold fluorescent lighting softening for just a heartbeat. This simple act, a phrase spoken in his mother tongue, a moment of human connection, begins to thaw the walls of isolation that have been closing in around him. It's a gesture loaded with compassion, courage, and recognition that goes far beyond words. It's the key that unlocks a hidden dignity that had been forgotten in the rush of procedures and suspicion. The security officers pause their questioning, their mechanical efficiency disrupted by this unexpected human element. Some look annoyed at the interruption, while others seem genuinely curious about this young woman who has dared to speak up. Lena stands quietly behind the partition, her hands clasped in front of her modest uniform. But her eyes burn with a quiet fire that speaks of courage born from understanding exactly what Samir is enduring. But to truly understand why this moment matters so deeply, why it will echo through both their lives for years to come, we have to step back and meet the parts of Samir's story that aren't visible in this sterile detention room. We need to understand the journey that brought him here, the dreams and losses that shaped him, and the invisible wounds that make Lena's simple act of recognition feel like salvation itself. Once, Samir was a boy growing up in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Dubai, where the gleaming towers of the future city were just dreams sketched on architects' drafting tables. His family's wealth wasn't inherited but earned through the kind of grinding sacrifice that leaves permanent marks on the soul. His father worked 16-hour days in the oil fields, coming home with hands blackened by crude and a back bent by physical labor that would eventually claim his health. His mother took in sewing from wealthy families in the city center, her delicate fingers working late into the night by lamplight, creating beautiful garments for people who would never know her name. Every dollar saved went toward Samir's education, every sacrifice made in service of a dream that seemed impossibly large for a family living in a 2-room apartment where the smell of cooking spices mixed with the industrial odors drifting in from nearby refineries. But behind every step forward, there were losses that carved deep trenches in young Samir's heart, losses that would shape the man he became and make him vulnerable to wounds that money could never heal. His mother fell ill when he was 16, her lungs weakened by years of inhaling fabric dust and working in poorly ventilated spaces. The medical bills consumed their modest savings faster than his father could replenish them, despite working even longer hours that left him exhausted and increasingly bitter. Samir watched his beautiful, gentle mother fade away in a hospital bed, her last words a whispered prayer that her son would find success and happiness in the wide world beyond their small neighborhood. His father never recovered from the loss, throwing himself into work with a desperate intensity that was part grief, part fury at a world that seemed designed to break people like them. He died 5 years later, his heart giving out during a particularly brutal shift in the desert heat, leaving Samir alone with a modest inheritance and an enormous hunger to prove that his parents' sacrifices hadn't been in vain. When Samir first arrived in New York 15 years ago, he carried with him not just business plans and investment strategies, but the silent strength of his heritage and the fierce love of a son who wanted nothing more than to honor his parents' memory through achievement that would make their sacrifices meaningful. The city towered around him like a concrete canyon, its skyscrapers reaching toward heaven while its streets pulsed with the dreams and desperation of millions seeking their own version of success. New York, with its endless possibilities and brutal competition, promised new beginnings, but also new challenges that his modest upbringing hadn't prepared him for. Samir learned quickly that success here required more than intelligence, more than capital, more than the work ethic his parents had instilled in him. He faced whispers in boardrooms, sideways looks at business dinners, and the stark reality that wealth couldn't buy the one thing he craved most: genuine acceptance and respect from his adopted city. His first major investment was a calculated risk in emerging technology stocks, turning his father's insurance payout and his mother's small savings into the foundation of what would become a multi-million-dollar portfolio. Within 3 years, he had diversified into real estate, acquiring properties in Manhattan's financial district when the market dipped after a minor recession. His business acumen was undeniable, his success meteoric. But the higher he climbed on the ladder of American achievement, the more isolated he felt from the human connections that had once sustained him. The airport incident was just one in a string of moments where he was seen as other, never fully American despite his citizenship, never quite trusted, despite his philanthropic contributions to the city that had made him wealthy. Each encounter with suspicion felt like a small death, killing bit by bit the hopeful young man who had arrived with such faith in the American dream. His fortune grew, investments in cryptocurrency yielding massive returns, his real estate empire expanding across multiple states, but his heart seemed to shrink with each year that passed. The morning of his detention started like any other. He had been returning from Dubai, where he had finalized a deal to establish a technology incubator that would create jobs for young entrepreneurs in his old neighborhood. The contracts in his briefcase represented not just millions in potential revenue, but his attempt to build a bridge between the world that made him and the world that raised him. He carried letters of recommendation from Dubai's business community, testimonials to his character from religious leaders, and documentation of his charitable work that spanned both continents. But when the security officer examined his papers with suspicious eyes, all of that documentation might as well have been written in invisible ink. The man's expression hardened as he compared Samir's face to his passport photo, as if searching for signs of deception in the slight differences that age and stress had carved into his features. The questions began simply enough: purpose of travel, length of stay abroad, but gradually became more invasive, more accusatory. "This document here," the officer said, holding up a letter written in Arabic script, "what exactly does this say?" His tone suggested that any writing in Samir's native language was inherently suspicious, inherently threatening. Samir explained patiently that it was a letter from a business partner confirming the details of their technology partnership, but his explanation seemed to only deepen the officer's suspicion. More officers were called over. Whispered consultations happened just out of Samir's hearing. Phone calls were made to unnamed supervisors who would review his case and determine whether this successful businessman posed a threat to national security. The absurdity of the situation would have been laughable if it weren't so humiliating, so devastating to the careful dignity he had spent decades constructing. What made Samir's story so heart-wrenching wasn't his fortune or fame, but his quiet vulnerability beneath all the outward success. Underneath the tailored suits and business achievements was a man aching for understanding, for the simple acknowledgement that he belonged in the country he had served faithfully for 15 years. The airport became a cold arena where his greatest internal conflict played out, the struggle between who he truly was and how the world insisted on seeing him. As the hours stretched on and his detention continued, Samir felt himself shrinking inside his expensive clothes. The marble floors that had seemed elegant now felt like the walls of a prison. The mechanical sounds of the airport, the hum of air conditioning, the distant rumble of departing planes, the electronic beeps of security equipment became a soundtrack to his deepening isolation. He closed his eyes and tried to remember his mother's voice, her gentle Arabic lullabies that had once made him feel safe and loved in a world that sometimes seemed too harsh for tender hearts. That was when Lena appeared at the partition, her voice cutting through his despair like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. In that moment of recognition, when she spoke to him in the language of his childhood, Samir felt something inside him come back to life, a spark of hope he had thought permanently extinguished. Enter Lena, the cafe waitress whose own story was written in the margins of the American dream, in the spaces between the grand narratives of success and failure that dominated the evening news. She was a woman of humble means, working her shift in the busy terminal cafe, navigating her own treacherous path as an immigrant, striving for independence in a city that simultaneously promised everything and demanded impossible sacrifices. Lena had been wiping down tables near the security checkpoint when she first noticed the commotion. At first, it was just raised voices and the usual bureaucratic theater that sometimes played out in airports. But as she watched the scene unfold, something about the detained man's quiet dignity, his patient responses to increasingly hostile questions, triggered a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. She saw in his careful composure the same protective mask she wore during her own encounters with authority, the same internal strength required to maintain grace under pressure. Her own journey to this moment had been marked by its own series of humiliations and small victories. Lena had arrived in New York 3 years earlier, carrying nothing but a nursing degree that American hospitals didn't recognize, and a heart full of determination that had already been tested by refugee camps and bureaucratic labyrinths across 2 continents. The cafe job was supposed to be temporary, just a way to pay rent while she studied for the licensing exams that would let her practice her profession in her new home. But temporary had stretched into permanence as bills mounted and exam fees proved more expensive than her modest salary could accommodate. Every day, she served coffee to business travelers who barely acknowledged her existence, cleaning up after people who earned more in a single transaction than she made in months. The work was honest, but exhausting, requiring her to stand for 8-hour shifts while maintaining a pleasant expression for customers who sometimes treated her like part of the furniture. Watching Samir's ordeal unfold behind the security partition awakened something fierce in Lena's chest. She recognized the particular type of institutional cruelty being visited upon him, the way authority figures could strip dignity from people who looked like them, spoke like them, carried the weight of complex histories that didn't fit neatly into American categories of belonging. She carried her own scars of loneliness and invisibility, moments when her accent or her hijab or simply the brownness of her skin had marked her as perpetually foreign, perpetually suspect. But Lena was also fiercely proud of her roots, determined to honor the culture and language that had sustained her through displacement and hardship. When she spotted Samir, so dignified in his expensive suit, yet so obviously vulnerable in his isolation, she felt a pull stronger than the fear that often silenced people in these moments. Fear of losing her job, fear of drawing unwanted attention to herself, fear of the retribution that sometimes followed acts of solidarity with the wrong people at the wrong time. Speaking to Samir in Arabic was her choice, a small act of rebellion against a system that seemed designed to erase stories like theirs. It was her way of saying, "You are not alone," her way of asserting that their shared language, their common humanity, mattered more than the borders and barriers that sought to divide them. In that instant of connection, both she and Samir were transformed from isolated individuals into part of something larger, a community of understanding that transcended the cold bureaucracy surrounding them. The detaining officers paused in their questioning, their mechanical efficiency disrupted by this unexpected intervention. Some looked annoyed at what they perceived as interference with official procedures, while others seemed genuinely curious about this young woman who had dared to speak up for a stranger. The tension that had clogged the air around the detention area lifted just enough for something new to enter, not quite hope, but the possibility of hope, the chance that this story might have a different ending than the one that seemed inevitable just moments before. But the story was far from over. In fact, Lena's brave intervention would set in motion a series of events that would test both of them in ways neither could anticipate. Speaking up for Samir was just the beginning of a journey that would force them both to confront questions about identity, belonging, justice, and the price of standing up for what's right in a world that often punishes such stands with swift and merciless consequences. The immediate effect of Lena's words was to humanize a situation that had become increasingly abstract and bureaucratic. Suddenly, there was a witness to Samir's ordeal, someone who understood not just his words, but the cultural context that made his detention so particularly cruel. Her presence at the partition drew attention from other travelers, some of whom began to pause and watch the unfolding drama with growing interest and sympathy. One of the security officers, a middle-aged man whose own grandparents had immigrated from Ireland decades earlier, found himself remembering stories of discrimination his family had faced. He began to look at Samir's documentation with fresh eyes, noticing details he had previously dismissed or misinterpreted. The letter in Arabic script, when properly translated, revealed itself to be exactly what Samir had claimed: a legitimate business correspondence from a respected Dubai firm confirming partnership details and vouching for his character. But bureaucratic machinery, once set in motion, is difficult to stop. Even as evidence mounted that Samir posed no threat, that his detention was based on misunderstandings and unconscious bias rather than legitimate security concerns, the process had to run its course. Forms had to be filed, supervisors consulted, procedures followed to their logical conclusion. The system protected itself through inertia, making it nearly impossible to admit error or reverse course without losing face. Lena remained at the partition throughout this extended ordeal, her presence a silent testimony to the power of human connection in the face of institutional indifference. She couldn't leave her post for long. Her supervisor had already given her sharp looks about spending too much time away from customer service, but she returned whenever possible, offering Samir small gestures of support that meant more than elaborate speeches could have conveyed. When one of the officers finally approached her and asked about her relationship to the detained man, Lena's answer was simple and profound. "He is from my homeland. That makes us family." The statement hung in the air like a challenge to the entire framework that had created this situation, asserting a loyalty that transcended national boundaries and bureaucratic categories. Her words reached other passengers waiting in the terminal, including several who began to recognize the profound injustice unfolding before their eyes. A retired teacher from Brooklyn started asking pointed questions about why a man with proper documentation was being held without charges. A young journalist with her laptop open began documenting the incident on social media, her posts gaining traction as followers recognized the broader implications of what they were witnessing. The tide began to turn slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Phone calls were made to higher authorities who understood that detention situations could become public relations nightmares if mishandled. Lawyers were consulted. The original suspicious document was sent for professional translation, revealing that Samir's explanation had been accurate all along. But even as vindication approached, the damage had been done. Samir had been subjected to hours of interrogation based on nothing more substantial than his name, his appearance, and the prejudices of people who held power over his freedom. The violation went deeper than the time lost or the humiliation endured. It struck at the very heart of his sense of belonging in the country he had called home for 15 years. When he was finally released, his documentation returned with perfunctory apologies that seemed designed more to protect the agency than acknowledge his suffering. Samir felt hollowed out, diminished in ways that would take much longer to heal than the immediate crisis had taken to resolve. The officer shook his hand as if nothing significant had happened, as if the previous 4 hours had been a minor inconvenience rather than a profound assault on his dignity and citizenship. But Lena was still there, waiting by the security exit when he finally emerged from detention. Her shift had ended an hour earlier, but she had remained, understanding instinctively that the end of the bureaucratic ordeal didn't mean the end of his suffering. When their eyes met across the busy terminal, something passed between them that needed no words, a recognition of shared experience, mutual courage, and the kind of human connection that makes survival possible in a world that too often seems intent on breaking the spirits of people who don't fit its narrow definitions of belonging. Shukran, he said simply, the Arabic word for thank you carrying depths of meaning that no English equivalent could convey. Lena nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears that reflected both the pain of witnessing injustice and the joy of seeing it overcome, however partially, however temporarily. They parted that day with nothing more than this brief exchange, but both carried something away from the encounter that would change the trajectory of their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. For Samir, it was proof that kindness and courage still existed in a world that had seemed increasingly cold and hostile. For Lena, it was the knowledge that speaking up for others, despite personal risk, was not just morally right, but practically necessary for building the kind of community where people like them could not just survive, but truly thrive. In the weeks that followed, both would face consequences for this moment of connection. Samir would struggle with depression and a crisis of identity that his wealth and success couldn't resolve. Lena would face workplace retaliation and immigration complications that threatened her already precarious status in the country. But they would also discover reserves of strength and resilience they hadn't known they possessed, and eventually find their way back to each other in a reunion that would transform not just their own lives, but touch the lives of countless others who shared their struggles and dreams. The airport incident became a turning point, a moment of clarity that revealed both the cruelty and the potential for redemption that exist side by side in American society. It was a beginning disguised as an ending, a seed of hope planted in soil that seemed too harsh to nurture anything beautiful. But seeds have a way of surprising us, growing in directions and toward destinations we never anticipated, creating shade and bearing fruit for travelers we may never meet, but whose journeys we help make possible through small acts of courage and compassion. As the immediate crisis of the detention faded into memory, both Samir and Lena would discover that their moment of connection had been witnessed by more people than they realized, recorded and shared in ways that would eventually reach audiences far beyond the confines of a single airport terminal. The ripple effects of their encounter would spread outward like circles on water, touching lives and inspiring actions that neither could have predicted, but both would eventually recognize as the true legacy of their brief but transformative meeting. The story of what happened next, the challenges they faced, the growth they achieved, the community they helped build, would unfold over years rather than hours, proving that the most important changes in human society happen not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but through individual choices to see each other's humanity and respond with courage and compassion, even when such responses come at personal cost. But that night, as Samir returned to his Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park, and as Lena rode the subway back to her shared apartment in Queens, both carried with them the knowledge that something significant had shifted in their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. The loneliness that had defined so much of their immigrant experience had been pierced, if only briefly, by genuine human connection. And that connection, fragile as it seemed in the face of larger systemic problems, would prove to be the foundation upon which both would build new lives that honored both their heritage and their adopted home. The first few days after the airport incident passed in a strange, suspended state for both Samir and Lena. For Samir, returning to his normal routine felt impossible. The mahogany-paneled boardrooms where he conducted million-dollar negotiations, the private clubs where he dined with other successful businessmen, the charity galas where his presence was both expected and appreciated. All of it felt hollow, performative, like a play he was tired of performing. His penthouse apartment, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering expanse of Manhattan, had always been his sanctuary. The space was decorated with carefully chosen artifacts from his homeland, intricate Persian carpets, calligraphy that spelled out verses from poetry he had memorized as a child, photographs of his parents, taken before hardship, carved lines of worry into their faces. But now, surrounded by these reminders of who he had been and where he came from, Samir felt more disconnected than ever. He found himself standing at those vast windows late at night, looking down at the streams of traffic 20 floors below, wondering how many of those anonymous drivers had ever experienced the particular kind of humiliation he had endured. His reflection in the glass showed a successful man in expensive pajamas, but inside he felt like that scared boy from Dubai again, watching his mother fade away in a hospital bed while bureaucrats decided whether his family deserved compassion or suspicion. Sleep became elusive. When he did manage to drift off, his dreams were filled with the harsh fluorescent lighting of the detention room, the sound of papers being shuffled and reshuffled, the feeling of being examined like a specimen under a microscope. He would wake with his heart racing, his silk sheets damp with perspiration, the taste of institutional air conditioning still lingering in his mouth. His personal assistant, Maria, a efficient woman who had managed his schedule for 8 years, noticed the change immediately. Phone calls went unreturned, meetings were canceled or postponed indefinitely. When she finally worked up the courage to ask if everything was all right, Samir looked at her with eyes that seemed to see her clearly for the first time in years. "Maria," he asked, "in all the time you've worked for me, have you ever felt invisible? Like people look through you instead of at you?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it revealed a vulnerability she had never suspected lay beneath his polished professional demeanor. "Every day," she answered honestly, "but I thought that was just part of the job." Her response haunted him, making him realize how many people in his orbit might be experiencing their own versions of the invisibility and dismissal he had tasted so bitterly in the airport. Meanwhile, across the city in Queens, Lena was facing her own aftermath from that moment of courage. Her supervisor at the airport cafe, a thin man named Robert, whose personality seemed as bitter as the coffee he served, had called her into his cramped office the morning after the incident. Security footage had captured her interaction with the detained passenger, and while she had done nothing technically wrong, Robert made it clear that her behavior had been noted and was not appreciated. "We're here to serve coffee and sandwiches," he told her, his voice carrying the particular kind of contempt that some people reserve for those they perceive as overstepping invisible boundaries. "We're not here to get involved in security matters or immigration issues, or whatever social justice cause you think you're supporting. Keep your head down, do your job, and stay out of trouble, or find somewhere else to work." The threat was not subtle. In a city where service jobs were competitive and references mattered, Robert held significant power over Lena's ability to survive. She nodded and returned to her station, but inside she was churning with a mixture of anger and fear. The anger came from knowing she had done the right thing, the only thing her conscience had allowed. The fear came from knowing how precarious her position really was, how easily her life could be disrupted by men like Robert, who wielded their small powers like weapons. Her co-workers' reactions were mixed. Some avoided her entirely, afraid that association with someone who had been officially noticed might draw unwanted attention to their own immigration status or job performance. Others offered quiet words of support, sharing their own stories of times when they had witnessed injustice but had been too afraid to speak up. A few criticized her directly, arguing that she had risked not just her own job, but potentially compromised the employment of everyone who worked alongside her. "You don't understand how things work here," one of her colleagues, an older woman from El Salvador, told her during their shared break. "We keep our heads down. We do our work. We don't make waves. That's how we survive. That's how we send money home to our families. You can't save everyone, and you shouldn't try if it means losing what little we have." The words stung because they contained enough truth to be painful. Lena did send a portion of her wages to family members still struggling in refugee camps. Her own financial situation was precarious enough that losing this job would mean defaulting on rent, possibly facing eviction, certainly derailing her long-term plans to return to nursing. But she also couldn't shake the image of Samir's face in that detention room, the quiet dignity with which he had endured treatment that no human being should have to endure. In the days following the incident, Lena found herself paying closer attention to the interactions happening around her workplace. She watched business travelers dismiss service workers with barely a glance, demanding immediate attention while simultaneously treating the people providing it as essentially invisible. She noticed which customers said please and thank you, and which ones simply barked orders as if she were a machine designed to fulfill their needs without acknowledgement. The realization was both heartbreaking and revelatory. The same dynamics that had played out in Samir's detention were happening every day on a smaller scale throughout the airport, throughout the city, throughout the country. People were being reduced to their most superficial characteristics, their accents, their skin color, their clothing, their perceived social status, and treated accordingly. The humanity that connected all of them was being systematically ignored in favor of categories and prejudices that made genuine connection nearly impossible. As the weeks passed, both Samir and Lena found themselves changed by their brief encounter in ways they were still trying to understand. Samir began declining invitations to social events that suddenly seemed shallow and meaningless. Instead, he spent time walking through different neighborhoods in the city, really looking at the people he passed on the street, noticing details he had previously overlooked. He saw the exhaustion in the faces of food delivery workers rushing between apartments, the quiet pride of taxi drivers navigating impossible traffic while maintaining politeness with difficult passengers, the careful dignity of cleaning staff working overnight shifts to keep office buildings spotless for people who would never know their names. His cryptocurrency investments continued to generate enormous profits automatically. His real estate holdings appreciated in value. His business partnerships produced the kind of returns that financial magazines wrote articles about. But none of it felt meaningful anymore. The numbers in his bank account seemed like abstract symbols rather than representations of security or success. He began to question what he had been working toward all these years, what legacy he wanted to leave beyond mere accumulation of wealth. Lena, meanwhile, found herself speaking up more often in small situations, defending a coworker when customers became abusive, gently correcting misunderstandings before they escalated, offering assistance to confused travelers who seemed lost in the maze of airport bureaucracy. Each small act of courage made the next one easier, building her confidence in her own moral authority even as her job security remained uncertain. She also began attending community meetings in her Queens neighborhood, gatherings where immigrants shared resources and support for navigating the complex challenges of building lives in America. She discovered a network of mutual aid that had been operating quietly for years, helping people find jobs, understand legal procedures, care for children while parents worked multiple shifts, and maintain connections to the cultures and languages that sustained them through the difficulties of displacement. It was at one of these meetings that Lena first heard Samir's name mentioned again. A young journalist who had been following up on the airport incident had traced the story through social media posts and security footage, eventually identifying both the detained businessman and the cafe worker who had spoken up for him. The journalist, Maya Singh, was working on a longer piece about discrimination in airports and the role that bystander intervention could play in protecting vulnerable travelers. Maya attended the community meeting to interview Lena about her experience, but the conversation quickly expanded beyond the specific incident to explore larger questions about solidarity, courage, and the responsibility that people have to protect each other in systems that often fail to protect anyone. Lena found herself articulating ideas she hadn't fully realized she believed, finding language for feelings that had been building inside her since childhood. When I saw him in that room, she told Maya, I saw my uncle, who was detained at a border crossing for 6 hours because his English wasn't perfect. I saw my neighbor, who gets followed around in stores because security guards assume he's stealing. I saw myself, every time someone looks at my hijab before they look at my face, We're all connected by these experiences, whether we want to admit it or not. Maya's article, when it appeared in a progressive online magazine 6 weeks after the airport incident, presented both Samir and Lena as examples of how ordinary people could resist systemic prejudice through small acts of courage and recognition. The piece was widely shared on social media, generating discussions about airport security procedures, immigration policy, and the daily experiences of Muslims and Arabs in post-9/11 America. Samir read the article on his phone while sitting in his office overlooking the Hudson River, recognizing himself in Maya's description, even though his name had been changed to protect his privacy. The portrayal was sympathetic, but also unflinching about the larger forces that had created the situation in which he found himself. For the first time since the detention, he felt like someone understood not just what had happened to him, but why it mattered beyond his individual experience. The article also included Lena's contact information for readers who wanted to support her advocacy work in immigrant communities. Within days, she was receiving messages from people across the country sharing their own stories of discrimination and solidarity. Some offered financial support for her nursing school ambitions. Others invited her to speak at community events or participate in panel discussions about immigration and civil rights. The attention was overwhelming, but also energizing. Lena began to see that her moment of courage in the airport had been not an end, but a beginning, the start of a larger conversation about how people could support each other across lines of difference and inequality. She started writing responses to the messages she received, sharing resources and connecting people with similar experiences and goals. It was through this network that she learned about a community organization in Manhattan that was seeking funding for a new initiative focused on immigrant rights and cross-cultural understanding. The organization, called Bridges Across Waters, had been working in various ethnic communities throughout the city for several years, but they lacked the resources to expand their programs or hire additional staff. Their current funding was set to expire at the end of the year, potentially forcing them to close just as demand for their services was growing. Reading about Bridges Across Waters online, Lena felt a familiar stirring of hope mixed with determination. This was the kind of work she wanted to be part of, the kind of community building that could help prevent other people from experiencing the isolation and discrimination that she and Samir had both encountered. But the organization's fundraising efforts had been unsuccessful, and their grant applications had been rejected by foundations that seemed more interested in funding established institutions than grassroots community initiatives. That night, unable to sleep, Lena found herself thinking about Samir's expensive suit, his obvious wealth, the business empire that had been referenced in Maya's article. She wondered if he might be interested in supporting the kind of work that Bridges Across Waters was trying to do. The thought felt presumptuous. They had shared only a few words, and she had no idea whether his politics or priorities aligned with community organizing efforts. But the connection they had made in that moment of crisis felt significant enough to justify reaching out, even if rejection was likely. After several days of internal debate, Lena composed a careful email through the contact information Maya had provided. She introduced herself as the waitress from the airport, thanked him again for his grace under pressure, and described the work that Bridges Across Waters was doing. She explained their funding crisis and asked if he might be willing to meet with their director to learn more about their programs. She tried to strike a tone that was hopeful but not demanding, respectful but not deferential. Samir received the email on a Thursday morning while reviewing quarterly reports from his various investment portfolios. The numbers showed continued growth across all sectors. His technology stocks had appreciated by 18%, his real estate holdings had increased in value by 12%, and his cryptocurrency investments had generated returns that exceeded his most optimistic projections. But all of those figures seemed meaningless compared to the simple, sincere request from the woman who had offered him dignity in his moment of greatest vulnerability. He read Lena's email 3 times before crafting a response. He thanked her for reaching out and expressed genuine interest in learning more about bridges across waters. He suggested they meet for coffee, not in his corporate office with its intimidating luxury, but in a neutral location where they could talk as equals rather than as wealthy patron and supplicant. They arranged to meet the following Tuesday at a small cafe in Brooklyn, halfway between their respective neighborhoods. The choice of location was deliberate, somewhere neither of them would feel entirely comfortable or entirely out of place, somewhere that would require both of them to venture outside their usual environments and meet on more equal terms. The night before their meeting, both Samir and Lena found themselves unusually nervous. For Samir, the anxiety came from not knowing how to navigate a relationship that wasn't based on business interests or social obligations. Every significant interaction in his adult life had been structured by professional hierarchies, financial considerations, or social expectations. This felt different, more personal, more risky, more potentially meaningful. For Lena, the nerves stemmed from unfamiliarity with asking wealthy people for support. Her experience with fundraising was limited to small community events and online crowdfunding campaigns. The amounts of money that Bridges Across Waters needed seemed enormous to her, but she had no idea whether they would seem significant or trivial to someone with Samir's resources. She worried about appearing either too desperate or not desperate enough, too grateful or not grateful enough, too knowledgeable or not knowledgeable enough about the complexities of foundation funding and charitable giving. But beneath their anxiety, both carried a sense of anticipation that felt almost like hope. Their encounter in the airport had revealed possibilities for human connection that transcended the usual boundaries of class, culture, and circumstance. This meeting represented a chance to explore whether that connection could become the foundation for something larger, not just personal friendship, but meaningful collaboration in service of communities that desperately needed advocates and resources. As Tuesday approached, neither could have predicted how profoundly this coffee meeting would change not only their own lives, but the lives of hundreds of other people who would eventually benefit from the initiatives they would create together. But both sensed that they were approaching another threshold, another moment when small choices could have enormous consequences, another opportunity to choose courage and compassion over comfort and safety. The cafe where they met was unremarkable: worn wooden tables, mismatched chairs, the comfortable shabbiness of a neighborhood institution that prioritized atmosphere over appearance. Samir arrived first, choosing a corner table where they could speak privately without being overheard. He wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, having consciously decided against the business attire that might create unnecessary distance between them. Lena entered 10 minutes later, scanning the room until she spotted him. She had agonized over her outfit, finally settling on neat slacks and a cardigan that felt professional but not intimidating. When their eyes met across the cafe, both smiled with genuine warmth, remembering their moment of connection amid the harsh institutional lighting of airport security. "Thank you for coming," Lena said as she sat down, accepting Samir's offer to buy her coffee, a small gesture that acknowledged both his greater resources and her dignity in accepting help without shame. "Thank you for reaching out," he replied. "I've been thinking a lot about that day, about what happened and what it meant. I'm interested in hearing about this organization you mentioned." What followed was a conversation that stretched across 3 hours, interrupted only by refills of coffee, and the gradual realization that they were discussing not just funding for Bridges Across Waters, but the possibility of creating something entirely new. Lena described the community meetings she had been attending, the stories of discrimination and resilience she had been hearing, the networks of support that existed but needed strengthening and expansion. Samir shared his own growing awareness of the privilege his wealth afforded him and his desire to use those resources in ways that would honor his parents' sacrifices and his own experiences of marginalization and acceptance. He talked about feeling disconnected from meaningful work despite his business success, about wanting to build bridges between the communities that had shaped him and the society that had eventually embraced him. As they talked, a vision began to emerge, not just financial support for existing organizations, but the creation of a new foundation that could address multiple aspects of the immigrant experience simultaneously. Legal aid for people facing detention or deportation, job training programs that recognized professional credentials earned in other countries, language classes that went both directions, helping immigrants improve their English while teaching Arabic, Spanish, Mandarin, and other languages to American-born citizens interested in cross-cultural communication. The foundation would also create storytelling platforms where immigrants could share their experiences in their own words, challenging stereotypes and building empathy through personal narrative. It would fund emergency assistance for families facing crisis, provide scholarships for young people pursuing education despite legal or financial obstacles, and advocate for policy changes that would make the immigration system more humane and effective. "It's ambitious," Samir acknowledged as they discussed the scope of what they were envisioning. "It would require significant initial investment and ongoing funding commitments." "It's necessary," Lena responded. "Everything we're describing already exists in small ways, scattered across different communities and organizations. What doesn't exist is coordination, sustainability, and the kind of resources that could make these efforts truly effective." They agreed to meet again the following week with other community leaders and potential collaborators. Samir would consult with his financial advisors and legal team about the mechanics of establishing a foundation. Lena would reach out to the director of Bridges Across Waters and other organizations to gauge interest in collaboration rather than competition. Walking back to the subway after their meeting, both felt a sense of possibility that had been missing from their lives for months. The project they were contemplating would be complex and challenging, requiring them to navigate differences in background, resources, and experience. But it would also allow them to channel their individual experiences of injustice and resilience into collective action that could benefit thousands of other people facing similar challenges. For Samir, the foundation represented a chance to transform his wealth from a source of isolation into a tool for connection and justice. For Lena, it offered an opportunity to move beyond individual acts of courage to systemic change that could prevent other people from experiencing the discrimination and invisibility that had shaped her own journey. Neither could predict exactly how their collaboration would unfold or what obstacles they would encounter along the way, but both understood that they were embarking on something significant, not just a business partnership or charitable endeavor, but a friendship grounded in shared values and complementary strengths that could sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The foundation that would eventually bear Lena's name, honoring her courage in speaking up for a stranger, was still months away from becoming reality. But its conceptual birth in that unremarkable Brooklyn cafe represented a turning point for both of them, the moment when their individual stories of struggle and resilience began to weave together into something larger than either could have created alone. Over the following year, their weekly meetings expanded to include lawyers, community organizers, social workers, immigration advocates, and other professionals who could help transform their vision into practical programs and sustainable funding structures. The process was often frustrating, sometimes contentious, and always more complicated than either had initially anticipated. Samir discovered that his business acumen, while valuable, was insufficient preparation for the political and cultural complexities of community organizing. Lena learned that her passion and insight needed to be channeled through proper legal and administrative frameworks to achieve lasting impact. Both had to navigate the delicate balance between providing leadership and sharing power, between using their individual strengths and building collaborative decision-making processes. But slowly, steadily, their dream began to take concrete form. The Lena Foundation was officially incorporated 18 months after their first coffee meeting, with an initial endowment of $12 million from Samir's personal assets and a board of directors that reflected the diversity of communities they hoped to serve. Their first office was a modest space in Brooklyn, staffed by 3 full-time employees and powered by a network of volunteers drawn from the communities they had been meeting in and learning from. The foundation's first major initiative was a legal aid clinic providing free immigration services to detained individuals and their families. The clinic was staffed by volunteer attorneys and law students, coordinated by social workers who could navigate both legal procedures and the cultural and emotional needs of clients facing potential deportation. In its first 6 months of operation, the clinic successfully resolved 43 cases, keeping families together and helping people achieve legal status that had seemed impossible to obtain. Their second program focused on economic empowerment, providing microloans and business development support to immigrant entrepreneurs who struggled to access traditional banking services. The program was designed in consultation with successful business owners from various immigrant communities, ensuring that it addressed real barriers rather than imagined ones. Within a year, it had helped launch 27 small businesses, from food trucks to technology consulting firms to child care cooperatives. The foundation also established storytelling initiatives that gave immigrants platforms to share their experiences through written narratives, recorded interviews, and video documentaries. These stories were shared through social media, community events, and partnerships with schools and universities interested in building cultural competency among their students. The stories challenged stereotypes, built empathy, and created connections between people who might otherwise never have encountered each other's perspectives. As the foundation grew and its impact became measurable, both Samir and Lena found themselves changed by the work they were doing together. Samir's depression lifted as his wealth became a tool for justice rather than a source of isolation. His business success felt meaningful for the first time in years because it generated resources that could be channeled into community support and systemic change. Lena eventually left her job at the airport cafe to become the foundation's full-time program director, a role that utilized her natural empathy and growing expertise in community organizing. She enrolled in evening classes working toward a master's degree in nonprofit management, supported by a scholarship from the foundation that was also available to other immigrant women pursuing professional development. Their professional collaboration deepened into genuine friendship, built on shared values and complemented by their different perspectives and skills. Samir's strategic thinking and access to resources balanced Lena's community connections and intuitive understanding of immigrant needs. Their partnership became a model for how people from different backgrounds could work together effectively when motivated by common purpose rather than individual advancement. 5 years after their first meeting at the airport, the Lena Foundation had become one of the most respected immigrant rights organizations on the East Coast. It had helped thousands of individuals and families navigate legal challenges, supported hundreds of small businesses, and changed public discourse about immigration through its storytelling initiatives and policy advocacy work. More importantly, it had created a template for how personal experiences of injustice could be transformed into collective action for systemic change. The foundation's success inspired similar initiatives in other cities, staffed by people who had heard Samir and Lena speak at conferences or read about their work in newspapers and magazines. Their story was featured in documentaries about modern immigration and philanthropy. Academic researchers studied their model of cross-class collaboration. Social workers and community organizers attended workshops where Lena taught strategies for building trust and solidarity across cultural and economic differences. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the communities they served, the families who sent photos of graduation ceremonies made possible by educational scholarships, the business owners who invited them to grand opening celebrations for enterprises launched with foundation support, The young people who wrote letters describing how the Foundation's advocacy had prevented their deportation and allowed them to pursue their dreams in America. 10 years after that day in the airport, when Lena had spoken to Samir in Arabic, they were invited to speak together at a conference on immigration and civil rights. Standing before an audience of academics, activists, and policymakers, they reflected on the journey that had brought them from individual vulnerability to collective power. Change begins with recognition, Lena told the audience, recognizing each other's humanity, recognizing injustice when we see it, recognizing our responsibility to act even when action feels risky or insufficient. And it continues with relationship, Samir added, building connections across differences, sharing resources and responsibilities, creating institutions that can sustain progress beyond individual effort or goodwill. After their presentation, they were approached by dozens of people eager to start similar initiatives in their own communities. Students wanted to intern with the foundation. Lawyers offered to volunteer with the legal clinic. Social media influencers asked how they could amplify the foundation's work and message. But the conversation that moved them most came from a young woman named Fatima, a refugee from Syria who had been detained at Kennedy Airport just 3 months earlier. Like Samir a decade before, she had been held for hours while authorities questioned her documentation and motives for coming to America. Unlike Samir, she had benefited from reforms in airport security procedures that the foundation had helped advocate for, and she had been provided with legal representation from the foundation's rapid response team. "Because of what you built," Fatima told them, "I wasn't alone in that room. Someone was there to translate, someone was there to explain my rights, someone was there to make sure I was treated with dignity. You changed what it means to arrive in America for people like us." Standing in the hotel lobby after the conference, Samir and Lena reflected on how far they had traveled from that day when they were both isolated by circumstances beyond their control. They had not eliminated the systems that created discrimination and vulnerability, but they had built alternatives that proved change was possible and sustainable when people were willing to invest their resources and relationships in community-centered solutions. Their friendship had deepened over the years into something that felt like family, not the family defined by blood or marriage, but the chosen family that emerges when people commit to supporting each other through challenges and celebrating each other's growth. They had weathered disagreements about foundation strategy, personal setbacks and successes, and the inevitable frustrations that come with trying to change systems designed to resist change. Samir's wealth had grown substantially during the foundation's first decade, his investments continuing to appreciate even as he contributed millions to charitable giving. But wealth no longer defined his identity or his sense of purpose. He measured success by the foundation's impact reports, by the stories of lives changed and communities strengthened, by the growing network of organizations inspired by their model. Lena had completed her master's degree and been offered positions with several major national civil rights organizations, opportunities that would have significantly increased her salary and professional prestige. But she chose to remain with the foundation, committed to the particular approach they had developed and the communities they continued to serve. Neither had expected their collaboration to last so long or achieve such substantial impact when they first met for coffee in that Brooklyn cafe. They had hoped to support important work and perhaps learn from each other about navigating life as immigrants in America. What they had created exceeded their initial dreams while remaining true to the values that had motivated their original connection. As they prepared to launch the foundation's second decade with expanded programming and increased funding commitments, both Samir and Lena understood that their individual stories had become part of something larger. A narrative about how personal vulnerability could become collective strength, how isolation could be transformed into community, how individual acts of courage could generate systemic change. The legacy they were building would outlast their own involvement with the foundation, creating resources and relationships that would continue supporting immigrant communities long after they had stepped back from day-to-day operations. The programs they had developed were being replicated in other cities. The advocacy strategies they had pioneered were being taught in graduate schools, and the model of collaboration they had embodied was inspiring partnerships between people from different backgrounds who might otherwise never have found common ground. Their story had become proof that the American dream was not just about individual success, but about using whatever privileges and platforms one acquired to lift up others who face similar or greater challenges. It demonstrated that true belonging in America came not from assimilation or acceptance by existing power structures, but from helping to create more inclusive and just power structures that could welcome everyone's contributions and honor everyone's dignity. But as they celebrated these achievements, both Samir and Lena remained aware that their work was far from finished. New waves of immigrants continued arriving daily, facing many of the same challenges that had shaped their own journeys decades earlier. The political climate around immigration grew increasingly hostile, requiring constant vigilance and advocacy to protect the rights and dignity of vulnerable populations. The Foundation began expanding its work to address emerging issues that their original programs hadn't anticipated. Climate displacement was creating new categories of refugees who didn't fit existing legal frameworks. Technological changes were transforming labor markets in ways that disproportionately affected immigrant workers. Young people who had grown up in America but lacked legal documentation were aging out of programs designed to protect them as children. Each new challenge required the Foundation to evolve and adapt, developing fresh approaches while maintaining the core values that had guided their work from the beginning. They hired staff with expertise in environmental law, labor organizing, and youth advocacy. They formed partnerships with organizations working on issues that intersected with immigration, but extended beyond their original scope. The growth wasn't always smooth. Rapid expansion strained their organizational capacity and tested their ability to maintain the intimate, community-centered approach that had made their early work so effective. Some longtime supporters worried that the Foundation was losing its focus, while newer funders pushed for greater emphasis on policy advocacy at the expense of direct service provision. Samir and Lena found themselves spending increasing amounts of time in meetings with lawyers, accountants, and board members, discussing compliance requirements and strategic planning rather than working directly with the communities they had set out to serve. The bureaucracy that had once oppressed them now threatened to overwhelm them from within, as success brought its own forms of institutional complexity. "Sometimes I feel like we're becoming the very thing we set out to challenge," Lena confided to Samir during one of their weekly walks through Prospect Park, a routine they had maintained even as their schedules became increasingly demanding. "All these forms and procedures and protocols, it's not what I imagined when we started." "I know," Samir replied, pausing to watch children playing on the playground while their parents chatted in multiple languages nearby. "But maybe that's the price of sustainability. Maybe we have to accept some bureaucracy if it means the work continues beyond us." Their conversation was interrupted by a young boy who had wandered away from his family and seemed lost and frightened. Without thinking, both Samir and Lena knelt down to his level, speaking gently in Arabic, until his mother came running over, relief and gratitude flooding her face as she thanked them for helping her son. The simple encounter reminded them why they had started the Foundation in the first place, not to build an institution or achieve recognition, but to ensure that vulnerable people weren't left to face their challenges alone. As they continued their walk, both felt renewed commitment to finding ways to preserve the human-centered approach that had made their work meaningful while navigating the complexities that growth had brought. They began delegating more operational responsibilities to their capable staff, trusting the team they had built to handle administrative tasks while they focused on program development and community engagement. They established advisory councils in each city where the Foundation operated, ensuring that local leaders had meaningful input into programming decisions rather than simply implementing strategies developed in the Brooklyn headquarters. Most importantly, they created formal mentorship programs that paired experienced organizers like themselves with younger activists who were just beginning their own journeys of community building. These relationships helped preserve institutional knowledge while bringing fresh perspectives and energy to the foundation's work. Through these mentorship programs, Samir and Lina met people like Ahmed, a Syrian refugee who had started organizing in his own community after receiving legal assistance from the foundation's clinic. Ahmed's approach to advocacy was different from theirs, more confrontational, less focused on building relationships with established institutions, but his passion and effectiveness were undeniable. "You built something beautiful," Ahmed told them during one of their mentorship sessions. "But my generation faces different challenges than yours did. We need to be willing to fight more directly, to demand change, rather than just demonstrate that we deserve it." His words challenged both Samir and Lina to examine their own assumptions about effective strategy and social change. They had come of age as immigrants during a time when assimilation and respectability were seen as pathways to acceptance. Younger activists like Ahmed had grown up in a political environment where such strategies seemed inadequate to address the scope and urgency of contemporary challenges. The foundation began supporting more diverse approaches to advocacy, funding both collaborative initiatives and confrontational campaigns, both policy research and direct action, both individual service provision, and systemic challenges to the structures that created need for such services. This expansion reflected their growing understanding that social change required multiple strategies working simultaneously, not just the particular approach that had worked for them. As the Foundation's 15th anniversary approached, Samir and Lina began planning a celebration that would honor not just their accomplishments, but the countless community members, staff, volunteers, and partners who had made those accomplishments possible. The event would feature storytelling from people whose lives had been changed by the Foundation's work, performances by artists from various immigrant communities, and presentations about new initiatives being launched by organizations inspired by their model. But as they worked on the guest list and program, both realized that the most meaningful celebration wouldn't be a single event, but rather the ongoing work itself, the daily phone calls from people seeking help, the weekly legal clinics where volunteer attorneys provided free consultation, the monthly community meetings where neighbors shared resources and strategies for navigating common challenges. The true measure of their success wasn't the Foundation's budget or staff size or media coverage, but the extent to which they had helped create communities where people could support each other across differences of language, culture, legal status, and economic circumstance. This community-building work was less visible than policy victories or major grants, but it was more sustainable and ultimately more transformative. During the anniversary celebration held at a community center in Queens, speakers from 12 different countries shared stories about how the Foundation's programs had affected their lives. A taxi driver talked about accessing small business loans that had helped him start his own transportation company. A teacher described how storytelling workshops had helped her process trauma and find her voice as an advocate for other survivors. A teenager spoke about receiving scholarship support that had made college possible despite her family's undocumented status. But the moment that brought both Samir and Lina to tears came when Fatima, the young Syrian woman they had met at the conference, took the stage to announce that she had been accepted to law school and planned to specialize in immigration law. The scholarship program they had created 15 years earlier would help fund her education, and she had already committed to working at the Foundation's legal clinic during law school and after graduation. "This is what succession looks like," she told the audience, "not replacing the founders, but expanding the leadership, bringing new perspectives while maintaining the values that make this work possible and meaningful." Watching Fatima speak, Samir and Lina saw their own journey reflected and transformed in her story. She represented the next generation of immigrant leaders, people who would face different challenges but could build on the foundation, quite literally, that others had created for them. As they drove home together after the celebration, sharing the comfortable silence of old friends who no longer needed words to communicate their deepest feelings, both understood that they had reached another transition point in their personal and professional relationship. The foundation no longer needed their constant attention and guidance. The community they had helped build was generating its own leadership and setting its own priorities. This realization brought both sadness and satisfaction. After 15 years of intensive collaboration, they would have to find new ways to structure their friendship and their individual sense of purpose. But they had also accomplished something that had seemed impossible when they first met. They had helped create sustainable institutional change that would continue supporting immigrant communities long after they stepped back from leadership roles. In the months that followed the anniversary celebration, both began transitioning to advisory roles within the foundation, while pursuing other interests that their earlier focus on organizational development had postponed. Samir returned to his business activities with renewed energy, using his investment success to seed similar foundations in other cities and regions where immigrant communities lacked adequate advocacy and support services. Lena accepted a teaching position at a social work school where she could train future generations of community organizers while continuing her own research on effective approaches to cross-cultural coalition building. Her courses were popular among students who wanted to understand how personal experience could be channeled into institutional change without losing the empathy and authenticity that made such work meaningful. But they maintained their weekly walks through Prospect Park, using these conversations to process their ongoing experiences and plan new projects that might not fit within the Foundation's established programs. These walks had become sacred time for both of them, protected from the demands of meetings and deadlines and dedicated to the kind of reflective discussion that had sparked their collaboration in the first place. During one particularly beautiful spring afternoon, as cherry blossoms created a pink canopy above the path where they walked, Lena shared an idea she had been developing about creating a documentary series that would tell the stories of second-generation immigrants, the children and grandchildren of people who had built lives in America while maintaining connections to other cultures and languages. "There's something unique about that experience," she explained. "Growing up between worlds, translating not just languages but cultural expectations, serving as bridges between parents who may never fully feel American and a society that may never fully accept them as American." Samir was immediately intrigued by the concept. His own experience as a first-generation immigrant was well documented through the Foundation's storytelling initiatives, but he was curious about the experiences of people who had grown up navigating multiple cultural identities from childhood rather than adapting to new ones as adults. "I could help fund the production," he offered, "but more importantly, I know people who could help distribute it: television producers, streaming services, educational institutions that would use it for cultural competency training." As they continued walking and talking, another collaborative project began to take shape, not a replacement for the Foundation, but a complement to it, addressing aspects of the immigrant experience that their previous work had touched on but not fully explored. This new initiative would be smaller and more focused than the Foundation, but it would extend the reach of their shared mission to build understanding and empathy across cultural differences. The documentary series, which they eventually titled Between Worlds: Second-Generation Voices, took 3 years to produce and featured interviews with 47 people whose parents or grandparents had immigrated to America from countries across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. The participants ranged in age from teenagers to grandparents, representing diverse experiences of cultural navigation and identity formation. Each episode focused on a different theme: language preservation, religious practice, career choice, romantic relationships, parenting decisions, showing how second-generation immigrants approach these universal human experiences within the particular context of their bicultural backgrounds. The series avoided both stereotypical representations and overly celebratory narratives, instead presenting nuanced portraits of people making complex choices about how to honor their heritage while building lives in contemporary America. The series premiered at film festivals across the country before being distributed through streaming platforms and educational networks. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with viewers praising the series for its authentic portrayal of experiences that were simultaneously specific to immigrant communities and universally relatable to anyone who had ever felt caught between different worlds or expectations. More importantly for Samir and Lena, the series sparked conversations in communities across the country about the ongoing effects of immigration on American society and culture. Viewing parties were organized by community centers, religious organizations, and university student groups. Discussion guides were developed for high school and college courses. Social media campaigns encouraged viewers to share their own stories of cultural navigation and identity formation. The success of Between Worlds led to invitations for Samir and Lena to speak at conferences, universities, and community events about their approach to collaborative media production and cross-cultural storytelling. These speaking opportunities introduced them to other activists and artists who were working on similar projects, creating networks of collaboration that extended far beyond their own initiatives. Through these networks, they learned about innovative approaches to community organizing that were being developed by immigrant communities across the country. Young organizers were using social media and digital tools in ways that their generation hadn't imagined when they started the foundation. Artists were creating installations and performances that made complex political issues accessible to broader audiences. Entrepreneurs were launching businesses that served immigrant communities while challenging mainstream stereotypes about immigrant contributions to American economy and culture. Seeing this proliferation of creative activism made both Samir and Lena realize that their role was shifting again, from direct service provision and advocacy to supporting and connecting the work that others were developing. They began hosting quarterly gatherings that brought together activists, artists, and entrepreneurs from immigrant communities across the Northeast, providing space for people to share strategies, collaborate on projects, and build relationships that could sustain their work over time. These gatherings, held at a retreat center in upstate New York that Samir had purchased and donated for community use, became legendary in immigrant rights circles for the quality of conversation and connection they facilitated. Participants reported leaving these weekends with new partnerships, fresh approaches to persistent challenges, and renewed energy for their ongoing work. What we've created here feels like what I imagined America could be when I first arrived, one participant told Samir during the closing session of a particularly powerful gathering. People from all over the world, sharing their expertise and resources, building something together that none of us could create alone. The comment reminded Samir of his own early idealism about America, before airport detentions and workplace discrimination had worn down his optimism about belonging and acceptance. But it also highlighted how his collaboration with Lena had helped him rediscover that idealism in more mature and sustainable form. Not naive faith that American institutions would automatically welcome immigrants, but determined commitment to building the kinds of institutions and communities that could make such welcome possible. As they celebrated the 10th anniversary of the documentary series and the 20th anniversary of the foundation, Samir and Lena found themselves reflecting on the unexpected trajectory their lives had taken since that moment of recognition in the airport detention room. Neither had planned to become community organizers or media producers or retreat center hosts. They had simply responded to immediate need with available resources, and those responses had grown into initiatives that had touched thousands of lives across multiple generations. Their partnership had also evolved in ways neither had anticipated. What began as a practical collaboration between a wealthy businessman and a community advocate had deepened into something that felt like spiritual kinship, a shared understanding of how individual healing could become collective transformation when guided by values of justice, compassion, and mutual aid. But perhaps most surprisingly, their work had changed them both in fundamental ways that went beyond their public roles or professional achievements. Samir had discovered that his business success became meaningful only when channeled toward community benefit, leading him to restructure his entire investment portfolio around social impact rather than pure profit maximization. Lena had learned to navigate institutional power structures without compromising her commitment to grassroots organizing, developing skills that made her an effective advocate in policy arenas while maintaining her credibility in community settings. As they entered their 7th decade of life, both began thinking about legacy in new ways. The institutions they had built would continue operating beyond their direct involvement, but they wanted to ensure that the values and approaches that had guided their work would be preserved and adapted by future generations of leaders. They began writing jointly about their experiences, not as memoir or institutional history, but as practical guide for other people who wanted to transform personal experiences of injustice into collective action for systemic change. Their book, Recognition and Response: Building Community Across Difference, combined personal narrative with strategic analysis, offering both inspiration and concrete tools for effective organizing. The book became required reading in social work and public policy programs across the country, but its most important audience was community organizers who were facing the same challenges that Samir and Lena had navigated 25 years earlier. How to build sustainable institutions without losing sight of individual human needs. How to work across class and cultural differences without reproducing existing hierarchies. How to maintain hope and energy for long-term change while addressing immediate crises. Book tour events became opportunities for intergenerational dialogue between established activists and emerging leaders. At each stop, Samir and Lena shared the stage with local organizers who were adapting their strategies to contemporary challenges and circumstances. These conversations revealed both continuities and changes in immigrant experiences over time, highlighting persistent structural barriers while celebrating innovations in resistance and community building. During a book event in Los Angeles, they met Maria Elena, a young woman whose parents had benefited from the Foundation's legal clinic 15 years earlier when she was in elementary school. She was now finishing law school and had accepted a position with a legal aid organization that modeled its approach on the Foundation's work, but focused specifically on environmental justice issues affecting immigrant communities. "You saved my family," she told Samir and Lena during the book signing after the event. "But more than that, you showed us that we could save other families, that our experiences could become tools for helping others. That's what I'm trying to do now, in my own field and my own way." Standing in the bookstore afterward, surrounded by people who had stayed to continue conversations sparked by the evening's discussion, both Samir and Lena felt the particular satisfaction that comes from seeing seeds planted decades earlier bloom into unexpected gardens tended by others' hands. Their story had become part of a larger story, one that stretched back to include all the immigrants who had cleared paths that others could follow, and forward to include all the future community builders who would adapt their approaches to challenges not yet imagined. In recognizing this, they found not the end of their work, but its transformation into something larger and more lasting than any individual achievement. And have you ever cared for someone who later forgot you? Or have you been the silent strength behind a stranger's moment of crisis? Have you ever found yourself invisible in a room full of people, waiting for someone to see your humanity beyond your uniform, your accent, your appearance? Have you ever witnessed injustice and wondered whether speaking up would make a difference or just make trouble? Samir and Lena's story reminds us that the most powerful changes often begin with the smallest gestures, a word spoken in someone's native language, a moment of recognition across cultural and economic differences, a choice to act on empathy rather than fear. Their foundation continues to serve thousands of immigrants each year, But it all started with one woman deciding that a stranger's dignity mattered more than her job security, and one man deciding that his wealth could become a tool for justice rather than just a measure of success. Think about the Linas and Samirs in your own life, the people whose courage has made your journey possible, the people whose struggles mirror your own, even when their backgrounds seem different, the people whose success or failure affects your own community's well-being. How might your story become part of their story? How might their strength become part of your strength? These connections don't require foundations or formal organizations. They start with recognition, with seeing each other clearly and completely, with refusing to let anyone face their challenges alone. They grow through relationship, through sharing resources and responsibilities according to our different capacities and needs. They flourish when we commit to building something together that none of us could create individually. The documentary series, the retreat center, the mentorship programs, the book, all of these initiatives grew from that single moment when Lina chose to speak Arabic to a detained stranger, and Samir chose to receive that gesture as the gift it was intended to be. But the real legacy isn't any of these specific projects. It's the model they created for how personal vulnerability can become collective strength, how individual acts of courage can inspire institutional change, how strangers can become family when they commit to seeing and supporting each other's humanity. In a world that often seems designed to isolate us, to make us compete rather than collaborate, to convince us that our struggles are individual rather than shared, Samir and Lina's partnership offers proof that alternative approaches are possible and effective. Their story demonstrates that lasting change happens not through individual heroism, but through sustained relationship across differences, not through charity, but through solidarity, not through salvation, but through mutual aid and collective liberation. Today, 30 years after their first meeting in that sterile airport detention room, the ripple effects of their collaboration continue expanding in directions they never could have predicted. Former foundation staff have started similar organizations in cities across the country. Participants in the retreat center gatherings have launched innovative projects addressing immigration, environmental justice, economic inequality, and racial healing. Viewers of the documentary series have created their own storytelling initiatives celebrating the experiences of marginalized communities. Most importantly, the values they embodied, recognition, relationship, mutual aid, collective action, have been adopted and adapted by countless people who have never heard their names but who share their commitment to building more just and inclusive communities. In this way, their story becomes our story, their courage becomes our courage, their hope becomes our hope. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own experiences with vulnerability and resilience, with isolation and community, with fear and courage, please share it with others who might need to remember their own power to create change. Leave a comment telling us about a time when someone spoke your language, literally or figuratively, during a difficult moment in your life. Subscribe to hear more stories about how ordinary people create extraordinary change through small acts of recognition and solidarity. For additional stories about community building, immigrant experiences, and cross-cultural friendship, click the podcast link that will appear on your screen. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us and for being part of the ongoing story of how strangers become family, how individual struggles become collective strength, and how the dream of belonging becomes reality not just for some, but for all of us. See you in our next story, where we'll explore another chapter in the never-ending book of human courage and compassion.